Thank you very much, Fran, and may I first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we're having a very important discussion, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and particularly to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders and voices in the room today, and for the very generous invitation from Fran and Sharon to allow me to be a part of this global discussion, because certainly from where we see it at the moment, the connection between the global solidarity and the local solidarity is absolutely key to forging a better future. In many respects, of course, when we get into the detail of policy, we often talk about, I don't know what the language is globally, but what's the terms of the day at the moment? Complex, wicked problem, the sort of complexity of life. I think, however, there are some very clear and compelling truths which really come through. And certainly from where we see it at ACOS, what we say is the global institutions are on our side. The global consensus is that the big global challenges we face are inequality and climate change. And telling this story over and over again to help us to the resonance that has with people's sense of the challenges in our experience is very, very clear. People are getting it. And I think that for us in Australia, whilst I think in our day-to-day life, because we are an island, we're a very long way from a lot of the sort of regional discussions that go on. Many of us don't get often a chance to hang out in some of these other places. But so I do want to remind the people from Australia who didn't happen to get to the World Economic Forum, that the World Economic Forum a few weeks ago agreed that the biggest risk to economic well-being for the globe is inequality, the biggest risk. And that the IMF has fairly recently come through and concluded that in fact the most effective way to produce stronger economic growth is actually to lift up the incomes of people in the bottom 20% rather than lifting up the incomes of people in the top 20%. Okay? So look, obviously it's wonderful to be in a room of people from around the globe. I just do want to ground a little bit of it in some of the storytelling about the Australian context, because you certainly look at the big headline figures around Australia and you say, well, there is no excuse for us. We are one of the wealthiest countries in the globe, according to Credit Suisse, if you need to quote somebody. And quite clearly, we've had over 2 decades of relatively very strong economic growth in comparison to other countries. But the facts are this. That we have a significant problem of poverty and inequality in Australia. What we know is that we have almost 3 million people and 730,000 children who are living below the poverty line, and that our rate of poverty in Australia is the highest of all of the wealthy OECD countries except the United States, friend up there from the United States. What we also know is that we have a 70-year a peak in terms of inequality, and that our trajectory on that front is going in the wrong direction. So we definitely do not have the same extremes of inequality with many of you from countries in the room, but as I said at the beginning, Australia has no excuse in this area. We have a history of having been able to build a social security system, for us to have institutional arrangements that have protected us by and large, with some very notable exceptions, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, from the ravages of absolute destitution. But we are absolutely going in the wrong direction at this point in time in terms of the policy from government. As I said, the question of, well, what's the complexity of this? Human dignity is a really shared understanding. You know when you're not living a life of dignity. You know that when you don't have enough income to meet your essentials, and when you don't have a really safe roof over your head where you can build a life and you know that you are not when you are not being treated with respect. And I think that that's why we are seeing within the population, including in Australia, a groundswell of voices from the community saying, we are not happy. And you are right. We are right about that. We are not happy with the direction of the major parties and the direction of policy that has taken us along this path, where we see instinctively that in the health area, for example, whilst we're spending enormous amounts of money on private health insurance, which is, in real growth going absolutely upwards, people are paying more and more in terms of out-of-pocket expenses. We are not getting the kind of health outcomes we should be seeing from the kind of dollar-for-dollar investment that's going on. Where is the money going? And then you look to the powerful interests associated with the privatisation of health in Australia, and people get that. And what we've seen in the most recent sort of round of policy from the federal government, in particular, that we have had the continuing rhetoric, which is essentially about we need to cut taxes, we need to cut spending, and this is essentially trickle-down economics. And people are not buying it, and we are right. Just a little bit of detail on that. We've seen just in the last 12 months from the federal government a delivering of about $10 billion in tax cuts, both for people on higher incomes and also for companies. Just dealt with in the last day, Friday afternoon, 3 p.m. And into the night from our Senate. And at the same time, we've seen almost $15 billion stripped out of Social Security, and the government right now wants to take a further $7 billion out of the Social Security system. What does that mean? Well, it means if you're a single parent in Australia, for all of the single parents in Australia, about 40% of your kids are living below the poverty line. And when we've just had a report come out from, for example, in the education area, where we've got a very significant increase in the number of teachers that are paying out of their own pockets to cover the very basics, including food for kids in the Australian context. The role of NGOs. I mean, it's so crucial. So I just want to touch on that. I think one of the things that Australia can be very good at is when we head off on the global stage, some of our government representatives really like to point the finger elsewhere. We hear about corruption and, we hear about, nasty regimes that are, doing very, very bad things to NGOs, and we love to wave our finger in that way. But it is very real, the issue that is being raised in the room about the chilling effect, as I described it on the panel, about the impact of various government behaviours on the way in which people are feeling safe to speak up, grounded in facts about the kind of approaches we should be taking, including in health equity. I really urge you, if you haven't got it available, it's called Safeguarding Democracy. It was a piece of work that was done about 18 months ago, which documents a lot of what has gone on in this area in the Australian context. We have absolutely had government policy which has deliberately endeavoured to silence the voice of communities and NGOs. It's being done either through contractual terms, because in the Australian context there's a fair amount of government funding that goes out into the NGO environment. It's being done by relentless re-tendering competition, so you're feeling that if you speak up you will not be able to secure the critical services that you're providing in the community. And then we have had blatant examples of where important national voices, peak bodies, have just been completely defunded. Freedom to protest, G20. We had extremely tight regulation around the capacity for NGOs to organise around the G20, and we spoke up about that through the C20 at the time. Freedom of the press, for those of you, and I really want to say this, health professionals are so powerfully at the front line of being a strong voice, because it does connect with the vast population sense of what really matters to me. And so I think it was so important, for example, with our atrocious policy associated with the treatment of asylum seekers and refugees in Australia, that it has been the AMA and the health professionals that stood up on the front line to say we will not allow people to be taken back. But of course, the government does not like this. And so we've had laws that have endeavoured to silence voices, including NGOs over in the detention, offshore detention processes. And most recently, for example, in government's effort to save money from people who don't have a lot by so-called debts that they owe to Centrelink, which is our social security system in Australia. We've had ordinary people who's been speaking up, have their detailed information provided to the press to try and silence the voices of ordinary people who are just saying it's not fair, it's not okay. I must say I'm so thrilled to be on a panel, Letitia, with you from South Africa, with all the challenges that South Africa faces. Your constitution is a dream. It is a dream in the Australian context. I want to acknowledge that for people who come from other countries, you may not realise that Australia does not have any constitutional human rights protections within it. Now, the Constitution in Australia is just 100 or so years old. The myth that gets told in the Australian environment about why we don't need one, when most other countries are either got one or working on one, from Sri Lanka. It's the myth that gets told, because we came out of the British colonialism, that at the time, the fathers, the males who were in control had it right. What actually the truth is in the Australian context, the reason we don't have those rights protections is because it was the miners in Western Australia who at the time did not want people from China to be able to hold mining leases, and so we wanted to be able to discriminate on the grounds of race, and so there were no rights protections effectively put in the Constitution, and the first policy we passed in Australia was the White Australia policy. So our ability to litigate, the importance of public interest litigation, is extremely limited in Australia. Now, having said all of that, I am absolutely encouraged and very confident that we are at a turning point, both the global voice, the fact that we are increasingly deeply connected, and the determination of many people, including many of you in this room, to be brave and to speak up. I completely accord with the view that it is our time to reach across from health, education, from community organisations, from the progressives amongst the business community who desperately want to see change in this direction we're seeing globally and locally on inequality and climate change. The reason I wasn't, unfortunately, in the room this morning, to listen to some of the great discussions going on was because I was on a phone hookup about exactly that, about mobilising around the lead up to this federal budget. So if you're interested in that one, please let me know. We can't quite make it as an announcement yet, but this is the kind of agenda that is absolutely within our hands. I think in terms of building the sense of context, depending on whichever country you're in, because it is different for different places, I think the challenge for the Australians in the room is it's a little bit of the gentleman's point about we're a little bit too polite, and it is wonderful to be spending time with other global citizens who really do face putting their lives on the line, to be reminded that actually we could probably crank it up in countries where that does not yet happen. I think the other part of it is that the capacity for us to really look at our own ethical questions around when is it okay for us to be silent and to be prepared to hold the line on things you will not sign, things you will not agree to, when research is being locked up behind closed doors because of the contracting arrangements, for us to mobilise and collectively say no. Because when we act in solidarity together, then they really do have a problem. And I'm very encouraged by the great sense in all the people that I'm spending time with that we are determined to change the dial on this. Because in fact, in the political environment, there is a real understanding behind closed doors also, that inequality is corrosive to electoral success, because if you haven't been reading any of the political news in Australia at the moment, our current government today is not travelling well in the polls. We think we have the answers for them, and we're here to help. Thank you.